Lloyd George, he has his own doubts about Churchill. He thinks of the man as definitely brilliant, but clearly lacking in judgment. And he has this wonderful phrase in 1916. He says, his steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. His steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. You think of an old-fashioned car and just the turning it this way or that, but the car's just zipping along regardless of what you try to do.
Welcome to Creating Churchill, an alternative biography of soldier, journalist, war leader and greatest Briton, Winston Churchill. His story has been told so many times, his bulldog image has become so familiar, that today Churchill can seem more meme than man. So this podcast series aims to get closer to the real Churchill, seeing him once again as his contemporaries saw him, the people he collaborated or clashed with. I'm Russell Barnes and I'm talking with historian David Reynolds, exploring how Churchill's life and character were shaped by relationships with friends, rivals, enemies and family. In this episode, Winston Churchill's early career explored through the relationship with his political mentor. In 1904, Churchill joins the Liberal Party. Crossing the floor of the House of Commons, he sits next to David Lloyd George, and together in opposition, they harry the Tory government of the day. I asked David first to describe what this dynamic duo of Lloyd George and Churchill might have looked like if you came across them in a House of Commons corridor.
Well, I think you would find it hard to stop them because they would be zipping along a House of Commons corridor. There was just an overwhelming sense of energy about these two people. They were always going somewhere. They were always doing something. And there's a photo I find very telling and very vivid. It's one taken in 1907 of Lloyd George on the left of the photograph, and Winston at his side looking at Lloyd George. And, Lloyd George is just brimming with energy. He's got his documents case under his arm. He's marching forward. There's a sense of purpose. Winston's looking at him almost warily. It's like somebody he's following, that he's close to, but he doesn't quite know what this man is about. I used it when I was writing the book, Mirrors of Greatness, and I put in as a caption, the Welsh wizard and his wary apprentice. The Welsh wizard and his wary apprentice. It was as if we're talking about the sorcerer's apprentice. Here are two men who make mischief. They both turn things upside down, but there's a clear sense of who's the sorcerer and who's the apprentice. So Lloyd George functions at that time, I think, in Winston's life as a kind of father figure, a more congenial father figure than Lord Randolph Churchill had ever been. But then, in a way, I suppose, that often happens with mentors, Churchill outgrew that. The mentor was seen almost as a rival and an obstacle to his own career.
So where has Lloyd George come from? Who was he? Where has he been doing his mischief so far?
He starts life born in Manchester. David George was his name. 1863 he was born, so that's 11 years before Winston Churchill. After his father died, he was adopted by his Welsh uncle, a man called Richard Lloyd, and that's why he took the name Lloyd as his middle name, so he was David Lloyd George. Uncle Lloyd was a shoemaker, a Baptist pastor in North Wales near Criccieth, and those Baptist roots were very important. Lloyd George sort of painted later on the idea that he came from nothing to greatness. The family was not poor. The house was full of books, and Lloyd George really loved reading, and he educated himself in many ways. He lost his religious faith as a teenager, but rather like Winston Churchill, this was transmuted into a sort of sense of his own providential destiny. And that was really important. So he moves into the legal profession. He gets to become a Liberal MP, 1890. And he's there actually for more than half a century for Carnarvon boroughs in North Wales. And that's how he makes his mark in national politics. Initially championing Welsh causes, temperance, land reform against the English aristocracy, but then also branching out in a passionate and genuine, but also calculated way into attacking the Boer War as an imperialist action and the government's cruel treatment of the Boers in the army camps and things like that. So this is a man on the make and knowing how to rise, already known as a really gifted silver-tongued orator.
So with this sense of providential destiny, you've got an ego there, obviously Churchill then as well, two rather large egos. How would you compare them? What were the similarities and differences? Obviously, Churchill comes from a very different background.
Yes, from an aristocratic background, and as I say, Lloyd George really making the most of his poor and Welsh roots. So Welsh being in antagonism, antipathy to the English aristocracy from which Winston came. In similarities, they're both regarded as little men in a big hurry in political terms, a lot of rivals really disliking them for this. But Lloyd George was a person who Churchill really did take seriously. Violet Asquith, who was the daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister, said his was the only personal leadership I've ever known Winston to accept unquestioningly in his whole political career. That Churchill was fascinated by a mind more swift and agile than his own, by its, she said, its fertility, its resource, its uncanny intuition and gymnastic nimbleness. And these were characteristics that Churchill didn't have, certainly at this stage of his career. And for many people, Lloyd George was a more feline character and almost had an animal quality to him. He was known as the goat, which was a reference to his agility, but also to his promiscuity as well. So there was a lot going on there. But the other thing that's also quite clear is that Lloyd George was a better listener. Despite his big mouth, he knew when to listen, whereas Winston Churchill tended to talk more and not listen. And Churchill admitted this once. He said to Lloyd George, "You don't excite yourself too much. You go about things quietly and calmly. But what you wish happens as you desire it. I'm too excitable. I tear about and make too much noise." And that was really rather striking. He recognized it himself in 1908, saying that to Lloyd George himself.
So Churchill became a leading member of the new Liberal government alongside Lloyd George in 1906. What's his approach to political power at this point?
He does get this idea of the need to catch attention publicly and politically by big ideas. And he also develops at this early stage the idea that one is more effective as a minister if you are in alliance with somebody else of similar attitudes and approach. So the double act is going to have almost triple the effect of the single act. And this is an idea that he develops with Lloyd George. It's also one you'll see later on in his career, rather surprisingly, with Neville Chamberlain in the 1920s. So Churchill's big opportunity really to do this kind of thing comes when he is appointed as president of the Board of Trade, which brings him into the cabinet only the age of 33. That's in 1908. And that's the big moment when he starts to have an effect.
Churchill's now at the Board of Trade, but how much of a liberal reformer was he really?
Well, Violet Asquith, who was his lifelong friend, starting in those days when her father was Prime Minister, said that Winston learned the language of radicalism. It was Lloyd George's native tongue, but it wasn't Winston's native tongue. And he always spoke it, despite considerable skill and effort, with a difference, she said. It didn't come naturally. And of course, many people thought that Churchill, the son of an aristocrat, playing this role was indeed political opportunism. And in politics, one has to realize, I think, that people are in politics because they want to advance themselves. They want to get to the top. It's ambition.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they lack principle. The challenge is to combine principle with ambition. And as ambition gets you to the top, you don't lose those principles.
Yeah.
And this, I think, was a challenge that Churchill wrestled with all through those Liberal years. The opportunism was there. And as I say, there were a lot of critics. It was often said that Lloyd George was born a cad and never forgot it. Winston was born a gentleman and never remembered it. But what's striking is that Churchill was also an emotional man. And in this period, he's actually in constituencies in the industrial north where he's seeing at firsthand poverty and deprivation in a way that he didn't see in rural Oxfordshire or around Blenheim. And there's an interesting entry in a diary of one of the Liberal MPs in 1908, and he depicts Churchill marching up and down the room and waving his arms around and talking passionately. And this diarist, Charles Masterman, says he's full of the poor whom he's just discovered. He thinks he's called by Providence to do something for them. And he even tells Masterman, sometimes I feel as if I could lift the whole world on my shoulders. That's part of the Liberal thing. Yes, there's an opportunism about it, but there's a genuineness about that feeling for people in distress. And he sees those people as a constituency MP in a way that he doesn't do again in the same way later on in his career.
Would it be fair to say that Winston Churchill is not a conviction politician? He's a man who is looking for opportunities to reform, yes, but also to make his name.
Yes, up to a point, I think that's true. But as I said, he discovers the poor and he does convince himself that this is a crusade that he can embark on. And he loves crusades. He loves missions that give direction to what he's doing. But the other thing to say is that although he's not, if you like, a natural radical in the way Lloyd George was because of his birth and background, Churchill, unlike Lloyd George, is, if you like, what we would call a public intellectual. He's a writer. He's someone who develops ideas, indeed, just they come flowing out of him in his newspaper articles, in his comments and his speeches. And he's one of the people who develops the notion of the new liberalism. He says, the cause of the Liberal Party, this is one of the big speeches that he gives, and the speeches are really important because he spends a lot of time on them. They are big intellectual projects. They're not just for slogans, as it were, and sound bites. He says the cause of the Liberal Party is the cause of the left out millions. He says what we need is a middle way between the ideologies of collectivism and individualism, because he says both of these are parts of man's dual nature, the social and the individual. And what he doesn't want to do, he said, is to impair the vigor of competition, but to help mitigate the consequences of failure. In other words, we want to have free competition upwards, but not free competition to run downwards. And that seems to me almost a precursor of the idea of levelling up in a way, levelling up but not levelling down. So here's an example of Churchill more than a century ago talking about ideas which are still kicking around today. And he does that as part of this public intellectual role. And what happens in this period of Churchill's political life from the 1900s to the end of the 1910s is that he develops a portfolio of jobs which is almost unique in the story of British politics, just the range of jobs he does in domestic affairs, in military affairs, the Navy, the Admiralty, the Army, and so on, Home Secretary. And you think of many politicians nowadays who are going in government office, even prime minister, with hardly any knowledge of any other departments. Yeah. If we're talking recent politics, Theresa May, always a home secretary. And it showed in trying to negotiate with foreigners and deal with the problems of the European Union and so on. Yeah. Churchill did have a remarkably full apprenticeship. Yeah. And that was part of what the Lloyd George years helped to give him.
As Churchill and Lloyd George take on bigger and bigger roles within the Liberal government, how does their relationship play out? How much do they get on?
Well, there's a phase when they're still focused on domestic problems and their own programs for social amelioration. They both, and this is striking if you think of Churchill's later career, they oppose higher defense spending, more money for battleships, the dreadnought battleships. And Lloyd George's budget in 1909, Lloyd George calls it a war budget,
Right.
but it's to raise money to wage implacable war against poverty and squalidness. And his tax rises create a crisis with the House of Lords, which in those days was able to block legislation, turn it down. So it becomes a complete battle over the powers of the House of Lords. Peers versus people was the Liberal slogan in 1910. And they have a wonderful time attacking the House of Lords, as Churchill talks of them as forces of reaction, old doddering peers, clever wire pullers, big brewers with bulbous noses. Lloyd George says that a fully equipped duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts, and they're just as great a terror, and they last longer. So this is almost, slapstick stuff, Punch and Judy stuff that they're doing here. And it's very entertaining. And it does have an effect. The Lords lose their ability to veto bills and only have the right to delay them. And that, of course, is where we still are today, the delaying powers of the House of Lords. But after the House of Lords crisis has been resolved, the questions between the two men become more significant and serious, particularly when Winston Churchill becomes Home Secretary, Lloyd George as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and there are now considerable strains. Churchill is still, I think, notorious in Labour circles for using soldiers against the strikers in the range of strikes in 1910, 1911. And the charge isn't justified in the most celebrated case, Tonopandi in South Wales, because he took pains to hold English troops in reserve, not to use them. But those troops stayed in the Rhondda Valley for another year, and that was a sort of intimidating presence. It certainly helped the mine owners resist the miners' demands. And certainly in the National Rail Strike of 1911, Churchill overrode army regulations, which said that it had to be the local civil power to decide whether to request military support if order broke down. In fact, Churchill there, I think, simply deployed the armed troops to key points to keep the trains moving because he believed national security was at stake. And this is where Lloyd George, if you like, the more natural listener of the two, throws himself into round-the-clock negotiations to try and end the strike, bring employers and union leaders together. And within 48 hours of intensive negotiation, he brings the strike to an end. And when Churchill hears this, he says, "I'm very sorry. It would have been better to have gone on and given those men a good thrashing." And that's a very clear example of the contrast in the two and their inclinations.
He discovered the poor and then lost them again.
Well, yes, which where the soldier in him comes out, I think, that, after a certain point, a firm hand is necessary.
Yeah.
Whereas for Lloyd George, the firm hand is always concealed in the silky glove, if you like.
Yeah.
The other issue on which they're at odds is suffragettes, and that's another question which comes right onto Winston's desk as Home Secretary. He's got to deal with the question of militant suffragettes who are doing violence against property and persons, hunger strikes in prison, all the rest of it. Churchill is really clear that he's not keen on women to have the vote. Lloyd George is, but he's also conscious of what's going to happen to politics if women do have the vote. It's going to hugely enlarge the electorate and bring in people who, in Lloyd George's estimation, and I think rightly, he thought of as people who would be more inclined to vote Tory than Liberal or the budding Labour Party. So rather than simply extend what was called the household franchise, which meant that you had a right to vote if you owned a certain amount of property, what he wanted to do was to move to a radical position of giving the vote to all adult males.
Right.
That addressed the democratic deficit. It also gave working class men the vote, and they're likely to be anti-Tory. And then he planned to add to that bill a provision for women's suffrage. So you give women the vote, but in a much larger electorate in which there are more anti-Tory men to offset that effect. And that's an example of Lloyd George, I think, thinking carefully about the issue, whereas Winston on certain things just had a gut reaction to this. He always, I think, felt that this idea of giving women the vote was a really serious mistake.
Yeah.
His idea was to hold 2 national referendum on female suffrage. The first one to find out if women wanted it, and the second one to find out if men would give it to them.
Yeah.
And he said, it would be a disaster, he told the Liberal chief whip. He said it'd be a ridiculous tragedy if this strong government and party, which has made its mark on history, were to go down on what he called petticoat politics.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
Always felt that women's suffrage made the country soft.
I mean, it's interesting with Churchill because you always get this sense of, as you said, a very excitable personality with very strong convictions, strongly worded convictions anyway. And yet he does try on ideologies like suits of clothes. And throughout his career, he moves quite smoothly from different positions. But at any given point, he's got extraordinary vehement opinions. It's an odd mix.
Yes, but I think probably most politicians, they're actors in a way. And when you're acting, you have to believe in your role. Yeah. And this was always a characteristic of Churchill. He really became passionate about the job that he was currently in. And the job that he really loved at a time when it was getting more and more difficult at the Home Office was when he was given the post of First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. And Violet Asquith, again, a useful barometer of these things, records him saying, "Look at the people I've had to deal with so far at the Home Office." He said, judges, convicts. This, the Admiralty, is the big thing, the biggest thing that's ever come my way. And she wrote, just after he died, really, in 1965, looking back, she said, "Never, before or since, have I seen him more completely and profoundly happy." This was a new job. He threw himself into it. And of course, it drew on his interest in matters military. He'd been trained as a soldier, but he understood military matters. And it's probably one of his most productive departmental jobs. He does some really significant things. He creates a naval general staff, which prepares the contingency planning to move 6 British divisions across the Channel in the event of war with Germany. And that was crucial in August 1914. He oversees the development of the new super dreadnoughts with 15-inch guns, 11-mile range. Now he's in the job of running the Navy. He's very keen on naval spending. That's part of the transformation.
Again, a complete volte-face.
Volte-face, absolutely.
That causes difficulties with Lloyd George, who's still Chancellor at this point.
That's right. There definitely is. And Lloyd George says in February 1912, he says, "Winston is Navy mad." As usual, he regards the office he presides over for the time being as the pivot upon which the universe attends. Churchill's obsession with naval rearmament creates a really big row between the two of them because Lloyd George is under a shadow in 1912. He's been accused of insider dealing over a share scandal to do with the firm Marconi. He's now looking to rebuild his reputation in the Liberal Party, so he gets into a new campaign of land reform, and that touches on Winston's own sensitivities. Lloyd George said he hates inflicting any hurt on the aristocracy. So they kind of come to a bargain that Churchill will support the land policy and Lloyd George grudgingly agrees to give him more money for the Navy. But this falls apart in 1913-14, and they have a row in cabinet and in public, which it takes actually the king to sort out a compromise. Winston gets some money for naval building in 1914-15. There's promises of reductions in 1915-16. But of course, by then, the world has changed enormously, so the promise isn't fulfilled.
Yeah.
But there was a real sense there of how these two men could become serious rivals, particularly if their departmental positions reinforced their increasing allergy to each other's political ambitions.
Reading your book, I was reminded there's a slightly strange quality to Churchill when war breaks out. He has, and he voices it quite clearly, a kind of excitement for war, a relish. It's a strange thing to read now. It's very honest in a strange way, but quite troubling as well.
Well, he is a soldier, and I think that's what comes back again in 1914. And there's always that backstory that's there of the feeling that he had in the 1890s, is my way to get to the top, to be another great war leader, to follow in the steps of heroes like James Wolfe at Quebec and Wellington and so on. He's not so keen on Wellington, but certainly Wolfe. So he's in his element when the war begins. He's quite clear that what's at stake is the balance of power in Europe. Germany is too powerful. Britain can't let it defeat France. Lloyd George is much more uncertain about this. And what really makes his mind up is not issues like the balance of power, which are power politics. It's actually Germany driving into Belgium, whose neutrality Britain's promised to defend. And Lloyd George comes out in an almost moral case for the war as defending the rights of small states like Belgium and Serbia against what he calls the Prussian Junkers, who are the road hogs of Europe, just driving over all the little people and the pedestrians and the small cars and so on. So very vivid, but a different kind of argument to Winston's balance of power. But the balance of power, which is an intellectual argument, is in a sense complemented for Churchill by what you were talking about, this sense of just being carried away by the moment. And in the most amazing situation in October 1914, so it's just a few weeks into the war, Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, rushes over to Antwerp to take personal command of the British forces helping to defend that port until hopefully the French reinforcements will arrive. Port's very significant, but this is the First Lord of the Admiralty becoming the local commander. He deploys a couple of brigades of the new Royal Navy division that he's organized. And Senior Admiral David Beatty says the man must be mad to think he can relieve Antwerp by putting 8,000 half-trained troops into it. And the cabinet, when they're told that Winston now wants to actually resign his office and be given military rank to take command at Antwerp, they just burst out laughing. Asquith tells him to come back, just finds Winston entranced by the idea of glittering commands. Political career is nothing to him in comparison with military glory. And Asquith says in his diary, he's a wonderful creature with a curious dash of schoolboy simplicity about him. And what someone said about genius, a zigzag streak of lightning in the brain.
Right.
And that's authentic Churchill as much as the public intellectual. And that's part of the fascination with the man. And it's what comes out in that moment of crisis in 1914.
Things start to go wrong for Churchill during the war, don't they? And that leads to another falling out with Lloyd George. Can you talk us through what happens with the Dardanelles campaign and how it goes so wrong?
Churchill believes war is won by action, by advance, by audacity. Napoleon's mantra, l'audace, toujours l'audace. If in doubt, attack. Don't sort of sit back and do nothing. So when they get stuck into the trenches by the end of 1914, he is increasingly agitated, as others are, about the stalemate. He's looking for, as he puts it, alternatives to chewing barbed wire on the Western Front. He wants attacks elsewhere. And there are various ideas for this, maybe the North German coast, but one that he and others come up with is the idea of trying to knock out Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, one of the Germans' main allies, through a strike driving through the Dardanelles, the straits that lead into the Sea of Marmara, and on to Constantinople, Istanbul, the headquarters of the Ottoman Empire. This is the campaign that he has in mind, and the Dardanelles become the great center, nodal point of the worst crisis in his career. Churchill's idea initially is that you can use the Navy to do this. It's increasingly clear that the Navy can't do that alone. Troops are drawn in. The blame for this is not entirely Churchill's, but the Tories, who are now in coalition in Asquith's government, a war coalition, and they say that Churchill has got to be made, if you like, almost the scapegoat for this. And so this is where the Tories take their revenge on Winston, the radical and the troublemaker and the opportunist, the Napoleon, if you like, which is a charge often thrown at Winston at the Antwerp campaign. And he is out of office, and it's an awful time for him. Though, again, what we see is a Churchillian reaction. Yes, he starts to learn to paint, but also he just says, okay, if I can't do anything in politics, I'm going to go out to the Western Front. He gets himself eventually a battalion command, but his aspiration is to become a big divisional commander and maybe play a part in shaping the war that way. So there again, you see that sort of flip from the politician to the soldier. He's attempting to move on from that setback in a positive way.
So Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister in 1916, and he could bring Churchill back. He chooses not to, causing further strain in their relationship. Yeah. Why does Lloyd George not do that?
One reason is simply, again, the Tories won't serve in a government where Churchill's involved. And Lloyd George actually asks Andrew Bonar Law, the Tory leader, he says, Churchill, is he more dangerous when he's for you than when he's against you? And Bonar Law's reply is quite clear. I would rather have him against us every time. So, remarkable sort of statement,
It sounds like Churchill is really tough work as a colleague.
He really is, yes. And Lloyd George feels it himself too, because it's not just Tory hatred. He has his own doubts about Churchill. He thinks of the man as definitely brilliant, but clearly lacking in judgment. And he has this wonderful phrase in 1916. He says, his steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. His steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. You think of an old-fashioned car and just the turning it this way or that, but the car's just zipping along regardless of what you try to do. And in the end, I think he brings him back into government in 1917 because he recognizes that he needs actually Winston's horsepower in key war jobs. Lloyd George has, before he was Prime Minister, he was Minister of Munitions, which was hugely important in actually getting the war industries and factories going to feed the guns on the Western Front, the soldiers with ammunition, shells, whatever it was. But he can't do that when he's Prime Minister, so Winston is the obvious person to do this. It reflects Lloyd George's inclination, which is different from Bonar Law, the Tory leader. There's a phrase from 1912 where he says to Churchill, I regard you as one might regard a leading barrister, that you don't want your opponent in a case to get. You retain him yourself. That's my position. I think your fees are rather excessive. I'm willing to go along with you, however, as far as I can do in reason. So the costs, in his view, of Winston being out are worse than having him in. The energy is worth it, despite the heavy maintenance required of having Winston in your cabinet.
I was struck in your book by an exchange between Churchill and Lloyd George as he campaigned to return to cabinet during the First World War. Churchill pleads, don't you care? And Lloyd George replies, all I care about is the war. It's revealing about what Churchill feels he's owed.
He does feel he's owed it. And he does take political rejections personally. I think it's perhaps the case that Lloyd George, is a fierce hater, but he doesn't let these things fester in quite the same way that I think Winston did. But you have to realize that being sacked over the Dardanelles seems like a huge turning point in a career which has so far been astronomically going upwards. And at the back of Winston's mind is always that feeling about what happened to his father, that rise comes before a fall. And in the case of Lord Randolph, that fall was terminal. And Clementine Churchill, Churchill's wife, said that when he was sacked, he was inconsolable. She said, I thought he would die of grief. And it was that sense really of not only the excitement of the job, but the feeling my political career is over. My hopes of greatness are gone.
Churchill does finally come back, as you said, to the coalition government as Minister for Munitions.
Yeah.
And it's during this period that he starts to focus on what he sees as the threat of Bolshevism after the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Russian Civil War that follows it. And this becomes a new point of tension between him and Lloyd George.
Yes, the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin taking over in Russia at the end of 1917, is a huge turning point in international history. And we can see that over the decades, right through the 20th century into the 21st century. But it becomes another obsession for Churchill. This is the cause he now latches onto. And it reflects his feeling that Russia is an important great power who we ought to be able to work with. After all, Tsarist Russia was our ally in the First World War until the revolution. But also Winston's feeling that Bolshevism is a complete anathema to anyone with civilized values. He refers to the foul baboonery of Bolshevism. It's an animal-like ideology, vicious, violent, bestial. These are the kind of terms he uses about it. And what he wants to do is restore Russia as a great friendly power. And to do that, he is quite happy to imagine a crusade against Bolshevism, using the Allied armies who've now defeated Germany against the Bolsheviks and trying to overthrow them and put back some kind of moderate, if not Tsarist, government. So this becomes a passion as far as he's concerned. Lloyd George gets really angry about it because Lloyd George's view is say, okay, we have to deal with the Bolshevik government. It's not going to change. We certainly don't have a war about it. What we'll try and do is bring it through negotiation into international diplomacy, international circles. And so he's looking, for example, for a trade agreement with the Bolsheviks, dangling the prospects of trade against some concessions and so on, trying to play normal diplomacy, whereas Churchill's talking about a crusade. And it strikes even people who are sympathetic to his doubts about Bolshevism. Balfour, Tory Foreign Secretary at the time, after one of Winston's tirades, he said, "I admire the exaggerated way you tell the truth." And that was characteristic of Churchill, really.
Yeah.
So this becomes a great obsession in those last few years, and one, of course, which reflects a set of attitudes which will feature in the rest of Churchill's career.
So does this trenchant position against Bolshevism and socialism become, if you like, the ticket which allows him to go back to the Tory fold?
Yes, it's not just a ticket. Again, I think it is a genuine feeling. As an observer, if you like, as a public intellectual, he sees the way that 19th century liberalism has run out of ideas, that the future battles are indeed between collectivism and individualism. And he thinks of the growing Labour Party within Britain as a pale reflection of Bolshevist ideology, collectivist ideology, so that when the coalition comes to an end in 1922, there's a brief Labour government, but by 1924, his attitude is that what matters now is opposition to the left, to socialism, to Bolshevism, and that means that it's a way back into the conservative fold. And that's a view that he holds for the rest of his life.
So following the end of that coalition, the general election, Churchill is kicked out. He loses his seat.
Yes, is that wonderful line where he says, because he had appendicitis, and he says, "In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix."
What was their relationship like following that?
Lloyd George is still a significant figure in the politics of the 1920s and early 30s. He's still fertile with ideas, and there's talk of a sort of British New Deal in the era of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. But Lloyd George never holds government office again after 1922, whereas Churchill bounces back. He comes into the Tory government. In the 1930s, he has a period in the wilderness, but as a public speaker, he is listened to much more than Lloyd George, and there's a significant divergence between them, probably the most fundamental of their whole careers, over the question of appeasement. Lloyd George is pretty credulous about Hitler. He visits Hitler at Berchtesgaden. He is in favor of appeasement, whereas Churchill comes out more and more strongly for rearmament and against appeasement, reflecting those strains between the two men that were there in the years around 1910, 1911, 1914. And so when Churchill comes back into office in 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty and then as Prime Minister in May 1940, Lloyd George is very much a backstage figure, though also a kind of brooding presence that people are still talking about and still on Churchill's mind.
So does Churchill think about actually bringing him back into government?
This is something that is thought about, but it's clear that Lloyd George now is tainted by appeasement, and also that Lloyd George's fidelity, if you like, his trustworthiness is not sure. And Lloyd George is on record privately as telling his private secretary in late 1940, I shall wait until Winston is bust. I shall wait until Winston is bust. In other words, some kind of illusion that he could somehow come back as war prime minister when Churchill lost out. So here you've got a man now who has really lost the plot in terms of the struggle with Germany, the possibility of a negotiated settlement with Germany, and also just on the purely personal level, Churchill, the soldier, almost relishes the war. Left to his own devices, he'd be up on top of number 10 Downing Street watching the bombs fall and so on. Lloyd George is in a complete funk about bombing. He's scared stiff of bombing. He doesn't have great physical courage in the way Churchill does. So there's a sense really that Churchill in the end has trumped his mentor. He has outstripped his mentor. And that's a very striking end to their long and tangled career.
Would you say these two were friends?
They were political friends in the way that many politicians are friends within the political arena. They certainly enjoyed dining together and talking together, partly because one of the things Churchill always liked about people was the pushback, the argument. He didn't like, as he said, doormats. And Lloyd George, there was a lot of toing and froing. You could have a good argument with Lloyd George. And that, I think, was an important part of it. But the relationship was clearly one of calculation as well. Lloyd George sees him as a figure that is problematic in so many ways, lacks judgment, all that kind of thing, but has the energy that is necessary to get jobs done. And he's seen so many time servers taking on ministries and doing nothing with it. So Churchill is a liability, but one that you can probably afford the costs of. Winston sees Lloyd George as essential for him to rise up, but always a feeling that Lloyd George is going to slightly marginalize him from the really top jobs. So it is a sort of marriage of convenience, but a very powerful one, and one that actually achieved significant things in its time in British politics. Churchill certainly thought of Lloyd George all the way through, I think, as a very significant political figure, but I think came to see the mentorship as a relationship that he, Winston, had outlived. And that was very clear by the end of his career. And as Lloyd George himself admitted, looking back on his own career, he said, I regard Winston as my only contemporary. Meaning by that, I regard Winston as the only person who was my equal. And that's Lloyd George's verdict in the last months of his life, 1944-45, as he looks at Churchill, the victorious war leader, victorious in a way that Lloyd George never was.
There's something fairly shifty about Lloyd George. We know about cash for honours and the bigamy potentially at certain points in his life.
Yeah.
Is there a sense in which he also does this to Churchill, that he says things in public which are supportive, but in private he's spreading gossip?
Yes, he can be very waspish about Churchill and about other people. Churchill also makes comments about other people, but there is, in the end, I think, a greater genuineness about Churchill, that you know where you are with him most of the time. You know, in fact, that he is a person of erratic moods. Part of what's striking, I think, is the way in which now we have this sense of Churchill as the bulldog. The only expression is with the jaw out and sort of rock-like. But most people who knew him were very aware of the volatility of his nature, the way that he could shift from one mood to another. He could suddenly get these incredible fantasies like rushing off to Antwerp or whatever it was. That was part of what it was to deal with Churchill. And it's why Asquith talked about that genius, that jagged streak of lightning in the brain. This was an extraordinary person, literally, and not an ordinary person. That was very clear to people.
So these are the two great war prime ministers, Lloyd George finishing the First World War, Churchill through the Second World War. How would you compare them as war leaders?
Well, Lloyd George fumes about the generals on many occasions, but he never gets involved in the running of the war in the way Churchill does. Churchill, of course, has this great advantage that he has two goes at the business of being right at the center of the war effort. And he learns an enormous amount from what happened in the First World War, usually learning from his mistakes. So one of them that he really thinks are essential is that he, as prime minister, will have control of strategy and indeed supervision of operations to some degree in a way that never happened in the First World War and certainly never happened to Lloyd George. And Lloyd George wasn't necessarily well prepared to do that, whereas Churchill did have these qualities. So what he does, one of his first acts in May 1940, is to make himself Minister of Defence. Not because there is a Ministry of Defence, there isn't. But what he then claimed through that title is that he can deal directly with the chiefs of staff, the heads of the three services, Army, Air, Navy, and can have meetings with them to go over strategy in a way that never happened in the First World War. So that Churchill becomes a military war leader in a way that Lloyd George never did. And that's, I think, of quite crucial importance.
You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. Follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram, and send us your comments and questions by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.